Well, hello and welcome to our event today here at the Cato Institute. Our apologies at the outset here. We were having a few technical difficulties, but we think we have those ironed out now, so we're going to go ahead and get rolling here. Today, we are going to be discussing a new book by Professor Daniel Chard of Western Washington University entitled Nixon's War at Home, the FBI, Leftist Guerrillas, and the Origins of Counterterrorism from University of North Carolina Press. Joining us for that is Dr. Beverly Gage, Professor of History and American Studies, and the Brady Johnson Professor of Grand Strategy at Yale University, and the author of The Day Wall Street Exploded, A Story of America in Its First Age of Terror. And finally, we're joined by my good friend from the Brennan Center, Faiza Patel, who is the co-director of the Brennan Center's Center for Justice, Brennan Center for Justice, Liberty, and National Security program. And she has authored multiple reports since 2011 on a wide range of national security and civil liberties related issues. And she is a lawyer herself and extremely versed in national security law. So we are very, very grateful that she has joined us today as well. Just a few housekeeping items here before we really get into the program in depth. You can submit your questions from Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, where this event is being live streamed. And if you want to ask a question, just simply use the hashtag Century of Surveillance, and that will get you into the queue there. We've got lots of additional resources on these particular topics having to do with privacy, civil liberties, and surveillance, of course, on our website. I want to just kind of begin with a little bit of scene setting here. This particular book is about a period of history that is among the most turbulent in that of our country's existence. Of course, that's the 1960s and 1970s. And this entire issue of terrorism, what constitutes terrorism, who engages in it, the reasons for it, and so on and so forth. These are all issues, essentially, that Daniel tries to explore. And Daniel, when I found out from our mutual friend Chip Gibbons over at Defending Dissent that you were working on this thing and it was actually going to be out this year, the first question that popped into my mind was, why this book? Why now? So kind of tell us a little bit about, what motivated you to do this.
Sure. Well, I want to thank you, Patrick, for inviting me here and for this forum with esteemed scholars in my field, Beverly Gage and Faiza Patel, and who I both really respect. And it's really a gift to be able to have this forum of people who've read my book and can comment on it. And I'll talk. Maybe this will come up later, but definitely Beverly Gage's work. She's probably one of the scholars whose work I engage with the most in this book. But I will say that. How did I come here? So to this topic, I started off kind of an unconventional way. I didn't come to this through a traditional kind of academic path. I went to college after high school, and I grew up in Norwalk, Connecticut. I went to college at New Haven's finest university, Southern Connecticut State University. Had to make a little joke, but I went to Southern, and I was involved in a lot of political activism, animal rights movement, environmental movement, the movement to free Mumia Abu-Jamal, which I was introduced to from people in New Haven. And I dropped out of college after the Battle of Seattle in 1999, and which was when protesters shut down the World Trade Organization meeting, and friends drove to the West Coast. We were interested in I wanted to be part of that and part of making kind of social change. And during that time in early 2000s, I was involved in the anarchist wing of the global justice movement and political prisoner support. And I even met and visited some political prisoners, people who had been incarcerated as a result of some of these guerrilla activities. I visited some of them in prison, and met some who had come out of prison. So it was later in 2006, I decided to go back to school at University of Southern Maine in Portland, and I decided to finish my history degree. And I was really interested. I knew I wanted for a thesis. I started doing research on a prisoners' rights group that was active in Maine in the 1970s, partly modeled after the Black Panthers. It was mostly white working class people, and some of them ended up going underground and being part of another leftist guerrilla group that was active in the Northeast in the late 70s and early 80s. So I studied that prisoners' rights group in Maine as a thesis. But when I went to graduate school at University of Massachusetts, I knew I wanted to research this stuff. And I was also coming out of being part of these movements and thinking about strategies and tactics for social change. And like one of the questions I was asking myself was about these leftist guerrilla groups was how do they impact or influence American politics beyond the radical left? And I started looking for answers to that question in FBI documents. I was, some of the first joint terrorism task forces that are later expanded in the post 9/11 era are actually formed New York, Chicago, and Boston in the late 70s and early 80s to go after domestic leftist guerrilla groups, including the one I mentioned for the Boston Joint Terrorism Task Force. But as I was trying to back up, getting to an earlier part of this, and I was looking through FBI surveillance documents and counterintelligence documents targeting the Students for a Democratic Society and the Weatherman faction that comes out of that in 1969, and seeing the word terrorism being used in these documents. And that's when and then it was around that time that I also encountered Beverly Gage's article in a journal of political history on Watergate and bureaucratic conflict. And so I realized that some of this leftist violence was really influencing something that is starting to become known as counterterrorism, and also wrapped up in this bureaucratic conflict that's happening within the FBI and between J. Edgar Hoover's FBI and the Nixon White House that leads to the Watergate scandal. So that's how I came to this topic.
Put a Privacy Act request in on yourself to see whether you have a file, because with all these folks that you were hanging out with, I'm just kind of suspicious that you might have become an object of interest to the Bureau itself. Have you ever done that?
You know what? My friend Ryan Shapiro, who started an organization, he did his doctorate at MIT, and he started a group called what's it called? Something for the people. I'm forgetting the name of it. It's something for the people, documents for the people, or something like that. But does Freedom of Information Privacy Act requests and tries to facilitate bringing a lot of the documents to the media. And I know that me and some other people who were involved in the animal rights activists back in the day, animal rights and anarchist movement back in the day, he's done a bunch of FOIA requests, but that's so recent, and these requests are stalled by the FBI, so regularly. Who knows if there's anything and if what they'll turn up. But I think there's an ongoing process where he's trying to.
Beverly Daniel has just used that magic word anarchist, right. And that is something that you have obviously a lot of experience with, kind of looking at this early 20th century era, and I'm just kind of wondering, your observations essentially about Daniel's work here in connection, with your own previous work. Do you think he's made a decent case here that it really did become much more of a thing, essentially from the 60s, essentially onward? Or are there aspects of what happened in the era that you have written about that you think are definitely relevant, to this whole terrorism discussion kind of generally?
Right. Well, thanks for having me here. Congratulations to Daniel on a terrific book. To give a quick answer to your question, I would say both. And there are really two ways that I intersect with Daniel's work. So one is the book that you mentioned, The Day Wall Street Exploded, which was a study of the rise of anarchist terrorism in particular, but in the context of broader labor struggles and labor violence in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and the federal responses to that. And then I'm also finishing a biography of J. Edgar Hoover that I've been working on for about a decade. So I've been deep in the 60s and 70s as well. I've seen some, though not all, of the materials that Daniel has looked at in that period. On the anarchism question, I think it is an interesting place to think about what is new in the 60s and 70s, because I think Daniel's absolutely right that there's something new there. I think what is not new in that moment is, first of all, a pretty broad conversation among leftists about the utility of violence, and particularly kind of spectacular violence, such as terrorism, as a possible revolutionary tactic. Right? That has a long history, and in many ways, the anarchists of the late 19th century were sort of the first real theorists of that. They had dynamite for the first time. They were really thinking in terms of revolution, and so a lot of the ideas that terrorist groups since that moment have used in one way or another look quite similar. And I think in the late 19th and early 20th century, you also have a lot of policing and federal as well as local and state responses to that, private responses as well, a sense that this is of concern, et cetera, that really resonate with what comes later. And one of the things that interested me about studying Hoover is that he is one of those points of continuity between those periods. He lived for so long, he stayed in office for so long, that he's there in 1919 and 1920 for this dramatic wave of anarchist bombings. And he's still there, as Daniel's book shows, in the 60s and 70s when a lot of this comes back around in some way or another. And in fact, Hoover himself is constantly describing these 60s and 70s movements as anarchistic. He is using this earlier period as his kind of imagined point of reference. So I think there are a lot of continuities, and what comes along in the 60s and 70s should be seen in that context. That said, I do think Daniel's right in the sense that what happens in the 60s and 70s is that while terrorism was a word earlier, it was in this kind of mix. The forms of violence look very similar. It becomes a category in its own right to be combated in a different way in the 60s and 70s, and then that becomes really obviously accelerated in the war on terror. The earlier war was a war on anarchism. People used the word terrorism, and there was a lot of terrorist violence, but it was about particular political contexts. Whereas what happens in this more recent era, in the last half century, is that the tactic itself has been sort of extracted out of its political context and has become the object of all of this policing. And in fact, as Daniel suggests, and as everyone here has written about, inspires a massive security apparatus with that as its central logic, as opposed to other ways of thinking about what that violence is about.
We use this word terrorism, but when did it actually get defined in federal law? I mean, do we have like a real legal framework essentially for categorizing essentially political violence?
Well, before I answer, the short answer to that is that there's all of the different intelligence agencies and different agencies of the state, the U.S. government, have different definitions of terrorism. There's not even a uniform agreement about that, and there are different like terrorism enhancement laws for prosecuting people that developed later in the 80s and especially after 9/11. But I'm wondering if I could take a moment to kind of explain some of the main arguments of the book, and so that and you know, and then kind of take it from there, so that the audience can.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
can kind of
but what,
can
but,
be grounded in
but
that
it,
as a basis for the discussion.
yeah, but I think really quickly, if I can turn to FISA, I think
Sure.
for me at least, what I think is important is for the audience to have a sense of whether or not we've actually got anything in the statute right now or in law essentially that kind of defines this stuff. I mean, and so can you, FISA, can you educate us quickly?
Sure. So basically, the US Code, federal law, contains a statutory definition of domestic terrorism and a statutory definition of international terrorism. So in essence, it says, these are actions that are violations of criminal law taken to coerce the government to change its position or to take certain actions. And then it sort of distinguishes between domestic terrorism as stuff that mainly takes place on the territory of the United States versus international terrorism, which is meant to be really focused on other countries, although that definition has been used pretty expansively, particularly since 9/11. And then when you look at the legal landscape, these are just definitions, right? These are not actual crimes of terrorism. And then what the federal code does is that it identifies various crimes as being terrorism crimes. And so these are crimes that are sort of specifically associated with political violence, such as hijackings, for example, but also situations where the federal government has a particular interest. So, assassinations of federal officials, for example. And then you have a sort of a third category, which is the most expansive category of terrorism crime, which is called material support for terrorism. And basically that has sort of two elements. One, which is used, in both the material support elements are used primarily for what we call international terrorism in the US, but one of them actually requires you to commit a criminal act that's sort of supporting an act of terrorism. But the second part, which is the most frequently used, requires just an intent to support an organization that is designated as a foreign terrorist organization. This is probably the most controversial part of the terrorism legal landscape because it allows the federal government to prosecute individuals who have done a very minimal amount of activity to support a foreign terrorist group and subject them to very long prison terms, up to 20 years in prison per count.
And am I correct that the statutory framework that you described was not in existence at the time of the events that Daniel describes in his book?
So I'm trying to think about when the terrorism definitions actually came into the US Code, and I don't know the answer to that. Certainly the international terrorism, in particular the material support provisions, right? Those were interestingly introduced during Bill Clinton's administration, and they were a response to a major domestic terrorism incident. So it's kind of an interesting twist where the sort of concern about domestic terrorism actually resulted in a provision that's primarily used for international terrorism.
So Daniel, back to you. With respect to the book, I could be wrong on this, but I think those original definitions didn't actually get into the statute until about 1992, if I recall correctly, if I'm reading the code correctly. This is a non-lawyer, potentially winging it here, looking at the U.S. Code, but I think, but certainly the material support provisions, all the rest of that, that's largely a post 9/11 phenomenon. So a lot of this stuff, Daniel, clearly post dates essentially, what you talk about there. And it seems to me that the fact that there really wasn't essentially any kind of hard and fast definition is one of the things that kind of worked to the advantage of the Nixon administration, right? I mean, they could basically decide, what they were going to declare to be, a threat to state security, et cetera, and categorize people as terrorists.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I mean, I think the best way to answer that is kind of giving an overview of the book's core arguments,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I think that I really appreciate what my colleagues have said here in terms of thinking about antecedents and past examples of conflicts with insurgent violence, anarchist violence. We can talk about the Klan as well, and then also some of the post 9/11 or post 1970s legal definitions of terrorism. I start off with my introduction off with an epigraph, which is a quote from an oral history that had been conducted with an FBI agent, William Dyson, who was one of the first FBI agents to investigate the Weather Underground and later other guerrilla groups or terror groups considered to be terrorists. And he went on to write one of the top textbooks used to train law enforcement intelligence officers in counterterrorism. And he says in this oral history that was conducted by the Society of Former Special Agents of the FBI, he said, these people are called what? These people who are doing these bombings on campuses, these anti-Vietnam War people that are trying to overthrow our government and get rid of the capitalist system, they're called, well, militants, revolutionaries, radicals, commies, pinkos, weirdos, beatniks. I mean, there's all sorts of terms. And he says in the early 1970s, the word terrorism creeps into our vocabulary. All of a sudden, these people are all sort of lumped into the word terrorism. And I go on to explain in that introduction that, and I'm drawing partly here from the work of Lisa Stampnitsky, whose book Disciplining Terror is a study of knowledge and power and discourse and how this term terror takes on a really important meaning, particularly after 1972. But I go on to say, this is a period when, in the Nixon era, when in response to hundreds of bombings being carried out by leftist guerrillas who were responding to state violence, the war in Vietnam, to racist policing and police violence in communities of color and against protesters. There's some who, for reasons I can explain later, who take up guerrilla warfare and kind of import it from Latin America and decolonial struggles into the US as a strategy for change, for a socialist revolution. In response to that, there's several things that happen in this conflict between leftist guerrillas, who are a minority of the left but have a big impact, and the state. So one is that you have the emergence of something called counterterrorism, which is preemptive policing designed to find people considered terrorists in advance and destroy them in advance, even before they carry out their violence. And there's a set of larger politics around that. But a big part of that advanced detection of terrorists is a mass surveillance. So one of the big arguments here is that this is a period where we see a shift in national security priorities away from anti-communism that was defined, the growth of the national security state during the Second Red Scare after World War II, towards anti-terrorism. And that specific framing allows political leaders and intelligence and law enforcement leaders to try to bring back illegal surveillance tactics that had been used against communists and actually had been that J. Edgar Hoover had stopped using, had put a ban on internally within the FBI, including break-ins, warrantless wiretapping, mail surveillance, revive them in the name of fighting terrorism.
But now let me just jump in real quick though. With respect to warrantless wiretapping, there was no actual cessation of that with respect to foreign intelligence threats during that period. So I think we do need to make a distinction here in terms of how wiretapping had been employed essentially since May of 1940, when President Roosevelt authorized then Attorney General Robert Jackson, despite the Nardone decision of the Supreme Court explicitly stating that the Communications Act prohibited wiretapping, telling Jackson that he was okay to go ahead and wiretap for, quote, national security purposes. The catch was that evidence could never be used in court. So it was always about essentially monitoring what, let's say, Soviet agents were up to, and then trying to find some other way, some other evidence, if you will, that they could get at it. But the wiretapping that you're referring to was very much focused on domestic entities, correct? That's
Yeah, correct. So there is some evidence of warrantless in this mid '60s period where it had been reined back, targeting potentially the Communist Party, and maybe even a little bit of SNCC, student nonviolent, under the auspices of being, trying to find espionage. And I can come back to that, but there's warrantless wiretapping was reined in during this period, partly because Attorney General Ramsey Clark had put some pressure on Hoover to do that.
Yeah.
So, but to kind of lay out the argument a bit more, okay, there's this shift from a reviving of illegal surveillance tactics, yes, domestically against American citizens. But also the terrorism framework is used, and it's not in a conspiracy, but in partly an improvisational way to develop new policing tactics that are new to this period. The FBI's first use of undercover agents, domestic interagency task forces framed as fighting terrorism, contingency plan for hostage situations. We also get the federal government's first institutions explicitly dedicated to fighting terrorism. The Houston Plan is short-lived, and we can talk about that more. And it ends because of a bureaucratic struggle between Hoover and Nixon, and is part of a big flare-up leading to in the bureaucratic conflict that, as Beverly Gage has noted, and I built upon, leads to Watergate. Reviving of mass surveillance targeting broad parts of the left, and also racialized suspect communities. I have a chapter called Arab Scare, talking about after the 1972 attacks at the Munich Olympics, how the FBI turns to, really harasses Arabs in the U.S. and Arab Americans, and kind of creates a template for some of the mass surveillance of Muslims in the 1990s and post 9/11 era. But another thing is that this counterterrorism existed as part of a larger political economy and political shift in American politics. Some in the field of studying mass incarceration or carceral state studies is referred to as a punitive turn in American politics, where there is a shift in federal spending priorities away from the social democracy of the New Deal and the Great Society towards mass incarceration. Right, and the development of counterterrorism is part of Nixon's law and order politics. That is part of that broader shift in American society as well. Another thing is that the stated objectives of a lot of these nascent counterterrorism operations are, the FBI is limited in its effectiveness in achieving its own goals, and there's all kinds of unintended consequences. And one of those, to bring me to the kind of the second main argument of the book, the first one being about the origins of counterterrorism, is that it contributes to this institutional conflict. And there's several flashpoints of this institutional conflict that kind of sets Nixon on the road to Watergate. The Houston Plan is one of them, which comes after the Weather Underground accidentally kills 3 of its own members. They kill themselves in a bomb explosion in Greenwich Village townhouse. Another is a young Black militant, Jonathan Jackson, who carries out an armed raid on a courthouse in August 1970 in California. And the Black Liberation Army starting a campaign of police assassinations in May 1971, and then the Munich attacks that were mentioned earlier. So, in essence, just so, yeah.
if I follow the argument, essentially here, you get the shift from Johnson to Nixon, and Nixon comes in essentially with this war on crime for all intents and purposes, right? I mean, this is a major theme of the 1968 campaign. All the campus disorders, all the rest of that. This is essentially the milieu that is happening in America at that particular time, and this is what gets Nixon, going in that whole, tough on crime, law and order kind of mindset. And if I interpret your work correctly, it is the issue of Hoover facing pressure from Nixon and others around him to take measures that Hoover and maybe some of his lieutenants were very reluctant to, because there was more congressional interest now in what the Bureau had been up to, right? And so this, if I understand correctly, is where we begin to kind of get the rub, where Nixon begins to look for essentially other means of achieving his ends of going after some of his opponents, because Hoover is not willing to necessarily go there. Am I reading that correctly, or am I misreading that?
Yeah. So, well, good. So the war on crime really starts under Lyndon Johnson, and with the passage of the Safe Streets Act. There's two versions of it. I think the first is 1966 and 1968, and that creates a basis of federal funding through block grants to different police departments. But Elizabeth Hinton has written about this in her book, and so have others. But one person behind the scenes really pressing for more funds to go to the FBI, when that's passed under the Johnson administration, is J. Edgar Hoover. But the Nixon, though, of course, runs on law and order politics, which in some ways is a code word for, a dog whistle for white voters' racial concerns, but also concerns about crime. But yeah, as soon as Nixon comes into office, he goes to Hoover and asks for intelligence to show that the different campus disorders, or urban uprisings, or riots are being directed by some sort of foreign entity, Cuba, or and Hoover actually says there's no intelligence to show this, and the Nixon officials don't like that, and that is kind of where some of this tension between Nixon and Hoover begins. They share a lot of the same ideology. Hoover and Nixon had been friends and worked together during the early Cold War, where Nixon kind of started off. But the Nixon, one of the things, and this is, again, I'm drawing from Beverly's work here. One of the things that Hoover's really concerned about as Nixon comes into office and during this period of more scrutiny of the FBI is the power of the FBI that he's built as an autonomous police agency. And part of what keeps that image and what keeps that autonomy and that power is this image of the FBI as these G-men who are defending America from national security and crime. And he's concerned about leaks of classified documents showing that he's engaged in illegal activities. So he's cautious about that. And that's where some of this tension begins as they start, Nixon and Hoover and even people in the FBI start to argue about, how do we deal with these clandestine leftist guerrillas, people who've gone underground, committed to carrying out revolutionary bombings, when we can't find them, and under whose authority, and who's going to sign off on authorizing the kind of illegal surveillance tactics to preempt this kind of activity.
So I want to turn back to Beverly quickly, because in the earlier age that you have written about, leading up to that terrible incident on Wall Street in 1920, there really was no comparable figure, and correct me if I'm off base here, but there really was no comparable figure at that point in time to what Hoover would become. Am I correct in that assessment?
That's correct. Yeah, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, policing in any area, much less in this sort of area, was very divided. So some of it was going on in local police departments, but they weren't very sophisticated. They weren't very well organized. They weren't very professional. The federal government did not a whole lot really until the First World War. And then in those years of 1919 and 1920, you see a big expansion of federal surveillance, but it's all new. A lot of it is pretty ham-handed, right? And again, there's a grappling, and you get a big expansion of the security establishment in that moment. And this is the moment that Hoover gets his start as a very young man. But it doesn't look anything like the sort of sophisticated, permanent security state that you have later on. And the third element early in the 20th century that would have been probably most aggressively engaged in some big counterterrorism investigation, if it required national and international scope, would have been private agencies. So one of the reasons that you get organizations like the Pinkertons or the William J. Burns Agency, these big private security agencies, is not only to do strike breaking and the sorts of things that they're quite famous for, but was also because they built these national and international sort of detective apparatuses to solve large scale crimes. So, but you had a very diffuse both security establishment to the degree that it existed at all and policing in that period. Fast forward to the 60s and 70s, and Hoover himself has really become the architect, certainly in terms of domestic surveillance, in terms of quote unquote professionalizing law enforcement. He becomes FBI director in 1924, and he dies in that office in 1972. Right? So he just is there for this whole story of the creation of the American security state. And the phrase national security has come up and is obviously still an important phrase. But I think one thing that's interesting for Hoover is that he takes, you mentioned Franklin Roosevelt in 1940 saying, well, I'm sure the Supreme Court didn't really mean it when they said no wiretapping, but for national security, we can go ahead and do it. And one of the things that happens is that national security becomes this incredibly capacious term, right? So that Hoover, even when he's going after domestic groups, is often describing this as, in fact, a matter of national security, sometimes because, as with the Communist Party, they are understood to have international ties, to be working with the Soviet Union, etc. And other times, national security becomes defined as kind of keeping order, preventing violence. So even groups that are purely domestic, such as the Ku Klux Klan, which is an important group that the FBI is running intelligence and counterintelligence operations against in the 60s during this same period, or groups on the left, they are often framed in a kind of national security intelligence story because that term has become so broad, and Hoover deploys it in so many different ways.
And Faiza, Beverly has touched on this issue from the early 20th century of kind of the privatized aspects of national security, and it seems to me, in many respects, we've kind of come full circle when we talk about things like Palantir and some of the others. And I'm just wondering, the work that you all have basically been doing at the Brennan Center, of course, elsewhere in the community, the parallels that you see there. Can you speak to that to a degree?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, reading the book was sort of a giant deja vu, because so much of what you described, Daniel, is sort of repeated in different forms. And one thing, I mean, certainly, when you were talking, Beverly, about Pinkertons and stuff, one of the things we've seen, particularly in the last decade, but really for a long time before that as well, is the ways in which the federal government and state and local police as well rely on the accumulation of information and the analysis of information by private companies. So Pat mentioned Palantir, which is obviously one of the best known of them, but there's so many of these companies that are aggregating data and then selling it or sharing it with the federal government. And as we all know, you have with huge data sets, you can actually develop very detailed information about individual Americans. And this information is now sort of combined with information that the government collects. And this creates obviously a huge and very unregulated surveillance space, right? So this is, while we have rules which are weak and oversight which is weak, relating to what federal law enforcement and intel agencies can do, and to some lesser extent what state and local can do, this is an entirely basically unregulated area in which huge amounts of information and surveillance capacities are built. The other thing I was thinking about it as we were talking about the book, and which is, when we talk about the emergence of terrorism as a term, one of the things that strikes me is, how much it was linked to the PLO. And certainly when you look at, the sort of trajectory of the use of the word terrorism and the concept of terrorism and terrorism laws in these sort of subsequent 50 years or so, it really, I think, hints at the racialized aspect of the term and what that means. And sort of related to that, one of the things that I thought was really striking about the book was the fact that, this idea that Nixon really sort of focused on one type of violence, but really ignored other types of violence, state violence in particular, and the violence from police departments. That to me has like a very has an analog, right, in the last 20 years, which is where I focus. So certainly, you have, lots of discussion, in the press and in policy circles about, the violence of U.S. Military interventions overseas. But if you were ever talking about terrorism with officials in the administration, there's no discussion of that, right? You simply cannot actually go back to talking about terrorism as political violence, because then that suggests that there is a solution that is based on politics, and the legitimacy of having, there's no acknowledgement of the legitimacy of having a discussion about the political underpinnings of certain kinds of violence. And I think that too, to some extent, has an extremely racialized component.
With respect
Absolutely.
to SDS
Absolutely.
and with respect to SDS and BLA, these are the entities that you spend so much of your time talking about here, these splinter factions essentially of, on the one hand, Students for a Democratic Society, and on the other hand, the Black Panthers. These splinter organizations had given up on conventional political solutions, and they engage in these activities. And you talk about essentially the almost the physics aspect of this, where there is an action, there will be an equal and opposite reaction. But in the case of the FBI, it was well beyond an equal reaction, right? I mean, they go after everybody's families and all the rest of this kind of thing. I mean, there's almost nobody, essentially, certainly on the SDS side, that they didn't try to basically go after in order to get to that really tiny number of actual militants. And the effort that was expended, and as you indicated, basically for naught, was astounding.
Yeah. No, thanks. And thanks for both of those comments. And I want to talk about the politics of counterterrorism that emerged during this period and how they are wrapped up in racism, racial inequality, economic inequality, U.S. imperialism. This is the war in Vietnam took the lives of over 3 million people in Southeast Asia, or Vietnam alone, and then more in Laos and Cambodia. And these movements and the turn to guerrilla warfare is an attempt to stop that kind of state violence, right, and this other police violence. The terrorism label, as it's being developed, is really used for this specific kind of violence, and it's used retroactively, to refer to the Klan. And there's conversations that start to have in the post 1970s or post 9/11 era about, how do we stabilize this definition of terrorism? But like that whole discussion comes later. Like we can go back to like periodization and definition and whether and appropriateness of the use of terrorism prior to the 1970s to historically, we can come back to that. But that whole discussion doesn't exist until after the 1970s. But I want to start by responding to what Faiza said, and then kind of also adding in a response to your comment, Patrick. But in terms of the politics behind this, well, actually, let me lay out some of the racial aspects first. First of all, in response to some of the urban uprisings in 1967, one of the things that Hoover institutes is a ghetto informant program, which is an effort to try to get informants in every urban Black community in the country in order to predict when a riot or uprising, civil disorder is going to happen in advance. And it was so ineffective. There was this pressure on field agents to develop informants. They created paper informants. They'd say, this janitor in Detroit, is giving me information, and they would just make stuff up. That was creating racialized suspect communities. At the same time, though, after Nixon comes into office, there's a move away from the kind of social democracy and government federal response to addressing those issues, underlying issues of inequality that were promoted in the Kerner Commission report, which was a report that said we need a government and a society that makes space for one people and gets rid of poverty and ends racism in law enforcement, right? Like that, the politics of law and order was a shift away from that and really ignoring that report. So instead, there's a way in which this is conflict management or damage control, and you rely on policing to try to deal with the violence that comes out of this inequality or that's coming in response to the state violence. Now, Hoover had mostly ignored the Klan during his career, and it's really in 1964 when, after the 3 civil rights workers are killed and murdered by the Klan with collusion of Southern police in Mississippi, that Johnson puts pressure on Hoover to go after the Klan, and he does, and the Klan is disrupted and as a national organization by the late 60s. So in terms of a national insurgency crossing state lines during this period, leftist guerrillas are the main focus, but they are the ones who are labeled as terrorists, and it's later expanded to looking at violence coming out of the Middle East. But look, in terms of the politics, it's important. One of the figures I talk about here is Strom Thurmond. Okay, Strom Thurmond is best known for being a segregationist, anti-communist, and he's one of the first Southern Democrats to switch parties to the Republican Party and try to shift white Southern votes and other white voters into the Republican base using law and order politics. During the 70s, after Watergate, he's the head of the Senate's Internal Security Subcommittee, having these small meetings where he's bringing in these anti-communist intellectuals, some of them who are just come out of right-wing think tanks, and he is trying to talk about the FALN, the Puerto Rican Independence guerrilla group that comes later in the 70s, and Weather Underground, Symbionese Liberation Army, and framing them as this terrorist threat, right? And it's those forums are mostly dismissed as these relics of McCarthyism and the Cold War. And after Hoover's worst nightmare comes true, partly because of the conflict over how to respond to these guerrilla bombings and peace activists breaking into the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania in 1971, after Hoover has claimed that a bunch of peace activists are going to engage in a terrorist activities in Washington, D.C., right? And we start to have the documents coming to the public and creating an uproar. People in the after that era and in the Watergate era Americans are more concerned about government overreach and shocked by that than they are about kind of the handful of guerrillas that are carrying out bombings that mostly are not lethal, but some of them certainly are. But it's really after Reagan comes into office in 1980 with the Reagan Revolution that you start to have Strom Thurmond then takes over the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and a new terrorism subcommittee is formed that's basically putting a new label on the Internal Security Subcommittee, and they're partly responsible for drafting the new language that rolls back the Attorney General guidelines for domestic security operations that had been put in place by Edward Levy after Watergate, the Attorney General under the Ford administration. The new Smith guidelines are put into place and partly drafted by that committee. So it's always been, and meanwhile, Reagan is exporting terrorism around the world, right? The Contras in Nicaragua, funding the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight the Soviets, while at the same time, after coming out of the Iran hostage crisis, saying that he's going to fight terrorism. So counterterrorism has always been highly political.
Faiza, looked like you had something you wanted to jump in with there.
Um, no, I was good.
Okay. Okay. I thought,
I
thought,
can jump
thought I
in
saw you there.
can I jump in on two things?
Please.
One is this debate over the word terrorism. And I think, as I was saying in my opening remarks, I think it is important to note that terrorism as a word, as a concept with a very narrow meaning, right? Anarchists a century earlier described what they were doing as terrorism, as terroristic. And there were also uses of the word terrorism that were much broader. People would describe, say, labor protests as terror and as terrorism. So I think the thing that happens in the 70s, and Daniel's right, and that's what's great about this book, is that you get this official debate beginning, right, among academics and lawyers and government officials seeking to kind of codify this, wrestle it to the ground, make it something sort of distinctive and in some ways separated from its political context, as others were saying. And one of the other pieces that I think is really useful about Daniel's book is that, in fact, he reminds us just how much violence there really was during this concentrated period of time, which I think many Americans tend to think back to the late 60s and early 70s as a period of kind of mass protest. But the depth of actually the violence that was being committed, right? Murders of policemen, hundreds of bombings going off, right? Fire bombings of ROTC center, all of this sort of stuff. I think it is important when we think about debates about violence today, say what's happened over the last year or two, debates over what happened in Portland, actually the scale of violence involved in kind of protest activity in the late 60s and early 70s is really entirely different from almost anything we've seen in a kind of highly politicized domestic way at the moment, at least anything that we've seen from the left in recent years. And so while this book is about a lot of these continuities, I think one of the great things about it is it also highlights some of the real differences, and people who are worried that, you know, this country has never been more divided in its history than it is today in 2021. Actually, things were pretty divided, right? And people were turning to actual guerrilla warfare in the late 60s and 70s because they so despaired of the American political system operating. So I think there are kind of important historical reminders on that end of things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to do a +1 for that, because it really is so striking, right? That when you sort of compare the sort of scale of violence that we've had in the 20 years since 9/11, and we do spend so much time talking about terrorism and so much time talking about, you know, the state response to terrorism, and you compare it to the 1970s, it really does feel like a drop in the bucket. You know, one other thing that I thought was really interesting about the book, which made me think sort of about our current situation, is sort of this shift from, you know, the idea of a communist threat that was really sort of inspired or instigated from overseas, and sort of the connections to the Soviet Union and Cuba, to sort of the leftist threat as envisioned as a purely domestic. And it's sort of really, I'm sort of thinking about, you know, how in the post 9/11 era, the government is really focused on sort of the threat from groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS, and now everyone's talking about domestic terrorism. We see sort of like almost a similar shift, right? Although maybe not in the government response in quite the same way. So I thought that was a really striking analogy.
Well, and I think we also have this problem essentially with what I think some folks refer to as availability bias, right?
Mm-hmm.
You wind up having an awful lot of media coverage, you know, essentially trying to convince people that, you know, there is an Islamist terrorist behind, you know, every tree or whatever. And to me, it just harkens back in many respects to the entire McCarthy era and essentially what Faiza was talking about with respect to that Cold War mentality. That is not, you know, in any way, you know, to diminish, you know, actual events, you know, when they do happen. But I think one of the things that I've always been concerned about with this whole issue of terrorism and the discussion surrounding it is that it tends to, make us numb to a lot of other forms of violence, that just tend to add up. I've been in Washington now for almost 34 years. And when I arrived here in 1988, Washington was literally the murder capital of the United States, down in Southeast, especially. I mean, over 500, almost 600, I think, in 1988 alone, who lost their lives in the city. And the number of people who wind up, getting killed, here and there, so to speak, those become real numbers, but they never get, the kind of traction as a general rule from a media standpoint, that a major terrorism or what is billed as a major terrorism event, itself actually gets. And I think, all of it essentially kind of has a numbing effect ultimately. But this constant drumbeat essentially, in our view, at least my view, definitely, has led to this radical militarization of our society. And in that respect, I really do think that, what Daniel has done here is help to kind of remind us, as Beverly indicated, that, in relative terms, this period that Daniel's written about was radical. I mean, literally, in terms of the level of violence, and not just the level of violence, by SDS or BLA, but the violence that was perpetrated against the communities out of which they originated. So it's just really striking.
Yeah. I mean, definitely any violence carried out by these guerrilla groups in terms of like fatalities pales in comparison with the violence carried out by the US in Vietnam, or, with funding of covert through, funding of proxies in places like later Nicaragua, as I mentioned, and other places. Speaking to, again, the theme that Faiz is bringing up, and this politics of counterterrorism. I mean, they're historically, since this period, the term counterterrorism operations and the politics of counterterrorism have mostly focused on the greater people coming out of, or thought to be coming out of, the greater Middle East. It's Arabs and Arab Americans in this period, and it's later, both as a response to the Iran hostage crisis and because of the blowback from the U.S. funding of Islamist, Sunni, Wahhabist guerrillas and fighters in Afghanistan, the blowback of 9/11. It's after that the focus is on Muslims as a racialized group or suspected Muslims. And the other group targeted has been leftists. Now, like white supremacist right-wing groups like that carried out of the, right-wing militia groups that carried out the Oklahoma City bombing. When the government has tried to focus on going after them in the 90s or now, right after January 6th, people in the Republican Party, leaders are pushing back, like, no, we can't, have surveillance against conservative movements, and I think we really see after January 6th the Republican Party mostly lining up behind Trump to block in the Senate, convicting him for the impeachment charges, like the Republican Party as a party of law and order to fight terrorism. You can really see the emperor's no clothes. It's a joke, right? But backing up to that, I want to add another dimension in this history here of this framing of terrorism in the 70s. I talk about L. Patrick Gray. He's the acting director of the FBI for 1 year after Hoover's death on May 2nd, 1972. Nixon appoints him. He had been served briefly in the Justice Department. He's brought in because Nixon wants his man heading the FBI, and that creates tensions with Mark Felt, who later becomes Deep Throat, and I talk about that more in the book. But shortly after the founding of the Cabinet Committee to Combat Terrorism, which is founded after the Munich attacks, L. Patrick Gray is giving a speech to a terrorism conference that is being held with other law enforcement at FBI headquarters in Quantico. And he says, "The terrorist is an outlaw, a wild animal, a jungle killer. How the terrorist got that way is not important," he continued. we're not interested in the psychological, philosophical, sociological factors on the terrorist scene. And I say the priority of law enforcement, Gray asserted, was not to understand terrorists and their motives, but to forcibly prevent them from killing people framed as innocents, right? And I go on to say, like, this is not just attack on so-called terrorists, it's attack on intellectualism. You know, wouldn't it make sense for law enforcement or political leaders to want to understand the motives of people that are engaged in violence? Because wouldn't that be a way to come up with solutions, whether they're law enforcement solutions or broader political solutions that might, you know, but it's clear here that talking about broader political solutions, you know, social democracy, human rights based on peace is off the table, right? And I say this is an example of what Lisa Stepnitsky calls, when she's referring to really the Bush era, of a politics of anti-knowledge, right? And right, this is echoing earlier concerns about communists, like, and I remember almost getting beat up for protesting the invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11, because it's like, to even question like what the government is doing, or to question like what are the motives, where are these terrorists coming from, that makes you suspect. So that's that politics of anti-knowledge, and that's connected with it can't be separated from, I'd say, the history of counterterrorism, you know. And there's echoes of that in earlier periods, you know, as Beverly is talking about, in her excellent book, it talks about this, but it gets framed around specifically around terrorism in this time.
And I think, you know, Faiza, we would be remiss if we did not, you know, kind of remind folks that this emphasis on the part of the Bureau and other American intelligence agencies on the American and Arab American and Muslim American community, this way predates 9/11. This goes back to the 1970s. The targeting of political intellectuals like the late Dr. Edward Said of Columbia, Palestinian youth groups here, student groups, you know, in this country. And we had a wave of this kind of thing after the first World Trade Center attack, with this vulgar betrayal investigation that took place in Chicago, literally for years. At Cato, we have over 35,000 pages of material on that investigation that we've managed to obtain via FOIA. But it really is kind of remarkable. You know, we're getting some interesting things from the social media feed right now. One individual on YouTube is asking whether or not we can talk about Mossad terrorism. I think I'll just say for myself, I think it's fairly clear that the Israeli government has for a very long time had a clear policy of utilizing violence essentially to go after individuals or organizations that it believes represents a threat to the Israeli state. I think we can have a real debate about whether or not, you know, some of those actions have actually been legitimate. But does anybody have anything they want to throw out there for the good of the order on that particular topic?
I can just say one thing, which is, you know, one of the points about the terrorism designation, right? Which is that it doesn't apply to state violence by definition, right? Terrorism is about non-state actors. And that obviously sort of goes to some of the points that Daniel raises in his book, which is that you sort of talk about one kind of violence and wanting to combat that kind of violence, but you don't talk about state violence. I think that's a recurring dynamic that we see across these issues.
We have another individual here who is, you know, raising this issue of whether or not there's a movement towards broadening terrorism again and linking it to Black Lives Matter. In the work that you all are doing in your respective fields, are you seeing that? Are you sensing that?
So, I mean, I think that's something that we've seen actually before Black Lives Matter, right? Which is that the sort of the expanded authorities and the breadth of the mandate given to law enforcement intelligence agencies match that sort of objective criteria for deciding who should and shouldn't be targeted for investigation were basically jettisoned. So that leaves a lot of discretion in individual agents to decide who they're going to target. And even before sort of the emergence of the BLM movement that was happening, And certainly in the last administration, we saw a deliberate attempt at framing racial justice protesters, including BLM, and then the sort of the Antifa label as terrorists and instigators of violence. Is very, very explicit effort to frame that. You saw former Attorney General Bill Barr specifically using those terms when talking about the racial justice protests across the country. Obviously, we saw what happened in Portland and in Washington, D.C. with the deployment of federal agents and the kind of federalized, militarized response, which sort of is more in sync with a national security threat than a protest or public safety issues. But I also want to just mention one thing and pick up on one thing that Daniel said, which is, how do we now deal with right-wing extremism or right-wing terrorism or right-wing violence, whatever you want to call it, which is that, I think we always have to be careful in allowing law enforcement and intelligence to target broad movements, which are political movements, in the name of countering terrorism. And, we certainly saw how that worked when it was targeted at Muslim Americans in the last 2 decades. But I would be very careful about expansive uses of notions of terrorism and notions of national security and the kind of the broad authorities and lack of oversight that come with them, and the work at basically sort of tarring broad groups of people as being suspicious because of their beliefs, no matter how repugnant those beliefs may be.
I think this is a place where it's probably good to remind folks that in 1968, in a landmark Supreme Court decision called Brandenburg v. Ohio, the Supreme Court made it clear that there is a difference between speech that is hateful and speech that is hateful that is a direct and imminent incitement to violence. In my view, at least, this is where the FBI has its biggest problems in the modern context, trying to draw those distinctions. And I just want to associate myself in full with what Faiza just said. I don't have, anything in common with people that are members of the Three Percenters or the Oath Keepers or any of those kinds of groups. But I will say that so long as they engage in activities in a way that is consistent with the First Amendment, they have a right to do so. What they don't have a right to do, what no group has a right to do, is use violence to try to overthrow the lawful government of the United States. And I think that is part of what we have to kind of get back to is a basic agreement societally, that the use of violence to try to change the nature of the government, if you will, is something that needs to be off the table essentially at all times.
Yeah. Yeah, to build on that, thank you. I would say this, in some ways, this brings us back to this historical framing in terrorism, and that maybe that debate. But to give the context of this, the more contemporary era, someone mentioned earlier, the chances of being killed by somebody that's considered like, a terrorist is very small. I mean, car accidents, opioid addictions, workplace accidents, not to mention, military intervention abroad, and all the kinds of insecurities that people have living in the new Gilded Age of economic inequality and climate change. So this is all this emphasis on one particular kind of violence, and then in debate over who should it be targeted or not comes out of this era of the 70s. And I think that in talking about terrorism historically, like, you can't really separate the conversation from the war on terrorism of the Bush era, which has been a failure. It hasn't prevented, it's created more violence. The history of wars on terrorism and counterterrorism, have shaped the world, you could argue, a lot more than a handful of guerrillas or bombers who are going against the state, even though they're certainly part of the broader conflicts. But so I think that's where some of the dangers of using terrorism to talk about some of the insurgent, anarchist, or Klan violence before that period lies. But back to that question also, though, in terms of political solutions, the Attorney General guidelines put in by Levy did limit the FBI's scope to having to, before they can engage in surveillance activities and get the Justice Department to authorize a wiretap, they had to show that there was evidence of violence being committed or imminent violence happening. And that was rolled back with the Smith guidelines, partly with, like I said, kind of stealthy policy analysts from the right influencing Republican politicians and Democratic politicians, but especially coming from the right after 9/11. But so there is the Levy guidelines, and then others have called for a congressional charter. I mean, on the FBI, I know Defending Rights and Dissent has, to have congressional oversight and accountability to the FBI. And I would agree with Faiza that, kind of extending the war on terrorism to the right is not good for our civil liberties or security. I mean, more so I'm more concerned about now that at the same time that there's these stalls to investigating the January 6th activity. The Republican Party is trying to now limit voting rights in places like Texas and using, anti-mask and anti-CRT critical race theory conspiracy theories to get people riled up to promote that kind of an agenda. And I think that so.
And I think just to make sure that folks understand here, Faiza had to leave us because of a competing commitment. We thank her for her participation. We're going to go ahead and drive on here for a little while. Just to remind all of you who might be watching on either Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook, just hashtag us at Century of Surveillance with your questions. We're happy to take those, as we go through here. I do want to, offer a couple of quick observations and just kind of get your reactions, both of you, to it. The concern that I have right now, quite frankly, about what I consider to be something of a little bit of an excess focus on January the 6th is that Congress right now, and I can tell you, just on the basis of the interactions that I've had with Hill staff, they're so seized of that particular incident that it is leading, in my judgment, to a failure to kind of look at a lot of these institutional, organizational issues that I think are a really big threat. Daniel, you've just talked about this issue of the FBI not having any kind of a legal charter. Folks are probably wondering why that's the case. Well, it's the case because when Ed Levy was Attorney General, this was in 1976. This, of course, is after all of these scandals having to do with the FBI's COINTELPRO had come out, Army surveillance, Navy surveillance, all these activities coming to light. But the FBI, of course, was the big focus, really kind of domestically here. And there was a push. There were actually several different bills that were introduced in that 1974 to 1977 era that would have created an actual legal charter for the FBI. But Levy got out in front of that bureaucratically, by releasing those Attorney General guidelines. And once he did that, it took the steam out, essentially, of any kind of real political effort to try to push through any legislation at that particular point in time. So we wind up getting, in this era of reform, in the post-Watergate era, we get the creation of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. We get the Inspector General Act of 1978. We get the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to go along with it. But we don't actually get a legal framework, for the FBI to operate within. I will just offer the observation, and I'd be interested to see what you all have to think about this, that sometimes it just doesn't matter what legal framework you create. If a president decides that he or she wants to go outside of that legal framework, more often than not, it will happen. And we saw that, of course, especially, in the post 9/11 era, when we had an entire massive surveillance program start just 2 days after the attacks, what became ultimately known as the Stellar Wind program, that had absolutely no real oversight whatsoever until it was in fact exposed by the New York Times in December of 2005. And the same, I think, applies with respect, to torture. The Bush administration, this whole rendition, detention, and interrogation program, or RDI program, that was run by my former employer, the Central Intelligence Agency. Torture was clearly illegal under U.S. and international law, and yet it took place. And it took place because the president wanted to do it. So, my question basically to both of you is, based on your own studies in this field, what's the solution, to that kind of circumstance? How can we do more, in essence, to prevent the kind of a recurrence of the kind of abuses that we have seen, from the Nixon era, on forward? I mean, is there any way, essentially, is there any magic formula that's going to allow us to do that? I will say candidly, I certainly don't have the answer. I'm not sure that I have the answer. I'm wondering if either of you might have at least some ideas.
Well, I could jump in on a couple of points with this, and I'm not sure I'm going to have a magical answer for you either. But one is that I do think the partisan politics of intelligence are quite interesting and have been quite interesting and more varied than a lot of people understand throughout history. But certainly since the 1970s, really as a result of the church investigation, as a result of the exposure of particularly the targeting of left-wing groups, illegal as well as legal surveillance of a wide variety of political groups, I think we have had a set of partisan affiliations in which the left has been very, sort of left liberals, libertarians certainly have been very suspicious of the security state, of federal surveillance. And one of the things that was really interesting to me in the Trump years and now in response to January 6th was to actually see at least some of this in a partisan sense flip around, right? So if you looked at the beginning of the Trump era, and you asked people what they thought of the FBI, or sort of pre-Trump, Democrats would have been overwhelmingly critical of the FBI, whereas Republicans would have said, national security, law and order. When you got into the Trump era, into the Mueller investigation, the showdown with Comey, and then I think we're seeing that extended with January 6th, suddenly it's, sort of liberals and leftists that are looking to institutions like the FBI to sort of save the republic from Trump. Whereas Republicans, and you can see this in public opinion polls, their opinion of the FBI, its trustworthiness, the role it ought to be playing has really plummeted. So I think that we're at a very interesting moment for these kinds of partisan politics, and I think it highlights some of what you've already suggested, which is that the big political challenge in a lot of these situations, whether you're talking about 100 years ago, 50 years ago, or the present, is that debates about violence are intimately connected with debates about speech, debates about civil liberties, debates about where this line is between legitimate political participation and illegitimate forms of political engagement, right, violence, and that those need to be thought of somewhat separately from whether or not you like the group that's being targeted, whether you want them to be able to express their ideas, et cetera. So that, I think, is one important point. I think the second, and this gets to your question of why the reforms of the 70s were as limited as they were, in the case of the FBI in particular, I think we have a vision of the Hoover era as Hoover being a kind of rogue agent off doing all sorts of, terrible secret things that nobody knew about. But as the record becomes clearer, it's pretty clear that he actually told Congress about, at least in one manner or another, in off-the-record and executive briefings about COINTELPRO. Certainly, he was out there in a very public way talking about the targeting of the Communist Party, right? The targeting of the New Left, et cetera. So if people didn't know every detail of what was going on, these were not big secrets in that sense. And I think presidents as well really used and cooperated with Hoover on a wide variety of activities that we would see as being quite objectionable. I mean, Lyndon Johnson, who was very good friends with Hoover, knew a whole lot about what they were doing to Martin Luther King. In many cases, he asked for them to do it. And in other cases, he simply didn't object. So there is a kind of broader, at least during this period, I think, collusion between institutions that are supposed to be putting checks and balances on each other. And I think that's one of the reasons that the reforms in the 70s ended up being really important, but also limited in key ways. As for the solution in this moment, I think the United States committed a long time ago to having a massive and permanent security state that operated domestically as well as in the rest of the world, much of which operates in secret. And so how to make that the most accountable, I think there are all sorts of mechanisms of transparency that we could think about. And I do think it is transparency that is the most important element of containing abuses. But the fact is, as you suggest, it's very difficult when you've committed to, for good reasons and maybe some for bad, right, to having a really big secretive intelligence establishment and military establishment in the way that the United States has. That's the big question on the table. What's that all about? And so finding ways to tinker with that are important and really critical. But that big question, I think, doesn't get asked all that often anymore. 100 years ago, it was being asked quite a lot. But that decision has been made, and I don't think that's on the table in our own moment.
Daniel?
That was such a great response. And I think what I'd add to that, thinking about how the book is, of course I have my political ideas, right? And my political ideas in the book, shape each other, but I really wrote the book as a history book and trying to kind of do a materialist analysis of power, social movements and the state in particular, different state agencies. And, what constituency of Americans were trying to wanted to build some end kind of U.S. imperialism, end the war in Vietnam, build a social democratic society in which, you didn't have poverty and gross economic inequality with racism and other forms of inequality and oppression sliced in. Well, it was the left, but the left, the left potentially working in coalition with others, liberals and others. So, I think in terms of addressing some of the underlying problems of violence, I think that, and this is where I shift to my political views. I do think that mass movements of people of regular people through the labor movement or, with also an inside out strategy, trying to have politicians who support social democratic reforms, as well as limits to the national security state. I think that's what's necessary. But how do we do that? There's not an easy answer, but I hope my book will be part of a conversation on that. And I want to also recognize, Cato has its own set of politics that in some ways there's common ground, but really go against some of that historically, in terms of definitely being opposed to social democracy. So, we should at least acknowledge that there's some differences here as well as common ground.
My response to that would be that those of us who consider ourselves to be of a liberty-centric mindset certainly are opposed to, concentrations of power that can really do a lot of damage to the individual. But I think I would certainly make the argument that the concentration of power in the federal government has become hands down the greatest threat to individual liberty in this country. And what we have seen in terms of this massive national security state that's been allowed to grow and metastasize. I like your phrase collusion, Beverly, because I think that there's a great deal of truth in that. in terms of the amount of bipartisan support ultimately that there's been for allowing this thing to grow. You know, we just think about the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which has got to be among the most abusive and most useless government entities created in the last century. And I think that, you know, that again is where I personally believe the anti-federalist from the post-revolution period really got it right in a lot of ways. You know, they warned about this repeatedly, this idea of allowing this kind of concentration of power in a security sense to take place would be inimical to the republic. And unfortunately, I think that's where we are. I think there is a way out, but I think that's probably a conversation for another time. Daniel Chard, Beverly Gage, and Faiza Patel, thank you today. Thanks to all of you who joined us today. We didn't get a chance to get to every question, but this thing will be posted on the web, I'm sure, within a day or two, so you can get back to it. But I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We hope you found it stimulating, and take care.